stands up and proclaims, "I've got it," assume that the can is open. So welcome everybody, and we'll get right into it again. That's the power of assumption. They couldn't open it, so hey, you're hungry, assume the can is open, that's easy. Anyhow, I was trying something new. It's called an icebreaker, folks. All right. So our guest speaker today is Ava Rodland. All right. She is a project manager in the Ministry of Financial Services, Trade and Industry and Immigration. In this role, she is primarily responsible for preparing the technical negotiating inputs for the government's bid to accede to the World Trade Organization. Prior to joining the ministry, Ava was an associate at Higgs & Johnson, practicing corporate and commercial law. She holds an LLM in international law with a focus on international trade, investments, and arbitration, jointly from the University of Heidelberg and the University of Chile, a law degree from the University of Cambridge, and a bachelor degree in international studies from the University of Chicago. So let's welcome Ava as she presents on WTO Accession and, I guess, professional services.
Thank you very much, Director Roach, P.S. Davis. Maybe I should have done that the other way around, I'm not sure. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to come and present on this, which seems to be a very hot topic. And hopefully through this presentation, you'll have an opportunity to have your questions addressed, and perhaps some of those concerns that you may have, we can address those as well. So I just wanted to start off with this map, which shows in green all of the members, all of the countries that are members currently of the WTO. And you will see that that is the majority of the world. Those countries that you see in yellow are countries that are in the process of joining the WTO. You may notice that on the left-hand side in the Western Hemisphere, all are in green, with the exception of the Bahamas, which you can't see because it is so small. But maybe some of you with good eyesight can see it from there. So we are the only country in the Western Hemisphere that's not a member of the WTO. Those countries in Northern and Eastern Africa are in the process of joining. You have some countries in the Middle East that are in the process of joining, and some in the Eastern European bloc, formerly part of the Soviet Union, also in the process of joining. Just about everybody else, except a few rogue countries and micro-states, are not members of the WTO. The reason I like to put this particular image on the screen is to dispel one of the major myths that we always hear when we talk about joining the WTO. Joining the WTO is about free movement of labor. Anybody's going to be able to come into this country and work. Well, if that was the case, all of those African nationals would have been knocking at the US door, would have been knocking at the European door and saying, hey, we're in the WTO, you're in the WTO, we come to work. Now, if you know anything about the United States and the current president, who's in the process of trying to build a wall, he wouldn't even be able to have that discussion if that was actually true. The WTO is not, never has been, never will be about the free movement of labor. It is about providing greater and freer movement of trade, goods, and services across borders. So how did we get here to this point? The Bahamas submitted its application to the WTO in 2001 to become a member. So in 2001, the government of the day decided it is going to start the process of joining the WTO. So we're now 18 years on, still involved in that process. There have been a few delays given changes in administration. We had a trade agreement that we negotiated with CARICOM, the Dominican Republic, and the European Union in 2008. So attention was diverted to that. And then economic climate, we had the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. So these are things that kind of, the government's attention was diverted. But we are still involved in this process. So I showed you the map of all the countries that are members of the WTO. This is just an idea, statistical correlation of the amount of trade. And this is trade in goods and services. When we're talking about the trade of products that cross borders, as well as services that cross borders, you'll see that 98.4% of all global trade, of all goods and services that cross border, is covered by the rules of the WTO. And then there's 1.5% of trade that is not covered by the rules of the WTO, and that's related to those countries that are in the process of joining the WTO, Bahamas included, and then the rest of the world, like those rogue countries and a few micro-states that I mentioned, completely outside the system. So as you can see, almost all of the countries of the world are members of the WTO, and they represent 98.4% of all global trade that's governed in accordance with the rules of the WTO. So why would the Bahamas want to join the WTO? This is a question we always get. In the country, there's a limited amount of money that's circulating. If we want, and in order to grow the economy, we need to get more money coming into the economy. So sometimes that's gonna happen through foreign direct investment. So you have foreigners come in and park their capital in the Bahamas. They invest in projects like big hotels, which creates jobs, creates opportunities for Bahamians. But there may even be instances where you have local persons who have money that's not in the economy. They have it somewhere else in the world, or they have it hidden under their couch or under their mattress because they don't have the confidence in the economy to reinvest it. So really, if we want to grow the economy, we need more money coming in. We need to have investment, either through domestic investment or foreign direct investment, to create new jobs, new opportunities. Because with a limited amount of money circulating, you can't have growth. You need to have more money coming into the economy. So the government considers that joining the WTO is a way to stimulate growth. How does the WTO help to achieve that growth? So really, this is through a process of reforming the economy. So the WTO requires newly acceding countries to the organization to reform and implement a number of significant reforms to its economy. And these reforms are based on the principles of the WTO, the underlying rules, which are basically based on economic principles of productivity, competitiveness, etc. So some of these reforms relate to improving the investment climate. When you improve the investment climate, you make your domestic economy more attractive for foreign direct investment. Improving the business climate as well, because you're talking about circulating money in the economy, making it easier to trade across borders. That always relates to doing business, so there's a need to improve the business climate. Increasing transparency, so how does the government operate? What are the rules and regulations, the rules of engagement to do business in the economy, to invest in the Bahamas? So traders, business people need to know what the rules are, need to have those published so that they're accessible for everybody. Implementing international best practices as they relate to trade, doing business, investment, standards for products entering the country, health and safety standards, for example, of food products that are imported, having a system of being able to test those and ensure that those products are actually safe for human consumption. An enhanced rule of law. A number of the WTO rules require there to be independent, or an opportunity for traders to be able to have their complaints heard by an independent tribunal. So if you have a decision that's made by the government and somebody has a complaint about it, then they should be able to submit that complaint to a tribunal that can independently make a decision on that. And reduce transaction costs. So the WTO, the reforms that are required, some of them require the government to improve the business and investment climate, which in itself is going to reduce transaction costs, because if it's easier to do business, that means it's quicker to do business, which means you're saving time and money. But also an important element of that is we're talking about also reducing customs duties. That's a very significant part of joining the WTO. Reducing customs duties, and that when you reduce duties for businesses who are trading, that's additional capital that they have, that they don't have to give to the government up front, that they can reinvest into their business. And even consumers. We import about 95% of all products that we consume. So if customs duties are lower, then that means it's a lower price, those goods. are less expensive, and so that's additional money that's in the pocket of consumers to do whatever it is that they want to do with those. So those are some of the reforms. These reforms are just the broad-based reforms, but they're reflected in specific rules of the WTO agreements. So the question that we always get is, okay, why do we need the WTO to help us with these reforms? Many of these reforms, as you can see, are reforms that really we should be doing on our own. These are reforms that are in the interest of the Bahamas for its development. Why do we need this international organization to force us or to push us towards doing these reforms? Well, the simple answer to that is we do not need the WTO to implement these reforms, but there is a benefit to using the WTO as a platform to implementing those reforms. And the reason being is because through the WTO system, you are basically putting your reform agenda for the world to see. So you are saying to the world, here is what we plan to do to reform our economy, and the entire international community is a part of that. Because you're also using these multilateral rules or these WTO rules. And then as a result of that, you are making commitments on an international level that you will implement these reforms. So what you're now doing is saying, this is our reform agenda, and we are going to make it legally binding at the international level. So you're giving it, you're creating a system that's more accountable. So now the reforms are not only accountable to us in the Bahamas, but also we're held to account at an international level. If that's the case, it means that if we implement all these reforms that are necessary for development, it becomes a lot more difficult to then backslide and undo it. Because now not only do you have to deal with the legislative part of it domestically, but you also have to deal with the fact that you've made these commitments through legally binding commitments at an international level, which makes it a lot more difficult to backslide. You get the international recognition because you're under the international spotlight. And this is signaling to foreign direct investors, it's signaling to states that the Bahamas is serious about reforming its economy, making it easier to do business, more transparent to do business, and integrating into the global economy. And then because, as I mentioned, you are using a system of rules to make legally binding commitments at an international level, then you're creating a degree of certainty and predictability that the world can see. So that in turn inspires confidence in your economy, not just from foreign direct investors. If you have a certain and domestic operating environment and business environment, investment environment, that also gives domestic investors more confidence in the economy to invest. So yes, you can reform yourself, but doing it through this platform, this international platform, makes it more likely that the reform is there to stay. When we look at countries that have recently acceded to the WTO, we can see how these reforms have impacted their economy. So you see I have two sets of bars here, blue and red. The blue bar is showing members, newly acceded members of the WTO. They had to go through this reform process, all of them. And then the red is the rest of the world. So original members of the WTO didn't have to go through this reform process. And so there's a difference there. In the first blue bar, you'll see 9.7% for newly acceding countries versus 5.8%. This is in their average annual growth rates for all of those countries who recently acceded to the WTO. And you'll see that from 1995 to 2016, they grew at almost double the pace of the rest of the world. It's not because they joined the WTO, it's because they implemented the reforms that joining the WTO requires. Those reforms which are required for making your economy more competitive, more productive. And so they grew at almost twice the rate of the rest of the world. And then you see we also have the bars from 2010 to 2016. That's showing what happened after the financial crisis. So when the entire world went into a financial crisis, 2007, 2008, you'll see that countries that recently acceded to the WTO in blue still doubled the performance of the rest of the world. So growth on a global level was less, but still newly acceded members of the WTO performed twice as well as the rest of the world did. We also did a model, so an economic dynamic equilibrium model that's supposed to look at the entire economy on a macro level. So looking at GDP growth, looking at poverty reduction, looking at increased competitiveness, looking at debt to government revenue. So we put all of this data into a model for the Bahamas to determine what would happen if the Bahamas joins the WTO. How would that impact the GDP, the gross domestic product, the growth of the Bahamas? And what you can see is we have blue and red again. So the blue bars represent what would have happened if, starting in 2017, the government just maintained doing exactly what it was doing in 2017. So all of the policies, everything that we had in place in 2017, the government made no changes, continued that policy, continued those policies. And then in the red is showing a situation where the government joins the WTO. So through the reforms that are required, through the customs duties reductions, and what you can see is that, again, the bars are showing that from 2017 to 2022, as a WTO member, assuming the government joined in 2017, because that's when the study started, over the 5-year period, the Bahamas would experience higher rates of growth in a post-WTO accession than it would in a non-WTO scenario. So again, the modeling that we have done for the Bahamian economy reflects the data that has been presented for countries that have already joined the WTO and shows that in a WTO situation, the Bahamas, the GDP rate of the Bahamas would grow at a faster pace than if we didn't join the WTO. So as I mentioned, the reason that the government decided to join the WTO is really, it boils down to that one word, growth, economic growth, growing the economy. So how does the WTO accession process work? There are 3 negotiating tracks. So really, all of this has to be negotiated. Our entry into the WTO has to be negotiated. And there are 3 tracks. There's the multilateral track, which deals with WTO rules, so the extent to which we are prepared to comply with the rules of the WTO. Plurilateral, which is kind of like multilateral, but really it's only specific issues like agriculture, health and safety issues. Sometimes they take a different track, not always. So, but the 2 important tracks are multilateral and bilateral. Bilateral is, we're talking about access that we provide to the market in the context of goods and services. So just to clarify, the multilateral track is dealing with the WTO rules. And there are the 4 rules that multilateral track is dealing with. So you have the rules of the WTO, which require most favored nation treatment. That means if you're importing a product, water for example, you treat all countries the same. All other countries that you're importing from. So if you're importing water from the United States, if you're importing it from Canada, if you're importing water from the European Union, you treat all of those waters the same. So if you charge a rate of 30%, you charge 30% for water coming from whatever country it's coming from. So that means you treat all countries equally. The second rule is national treatment. That means you treat foreign products and domestic products the same way. So if you're importing a bottle of Evian from the United States, when that product gets into the country, you treat it the same way as you treat Aquapure. What do I mean by that? If you charge a VAT rate of 12% for Aquapure water, then charge a rate of VAT 12% for Evian water. Don't charge 20% for foreign water, 12% for Bahamian water. So treat national and foreign products the same way. Transparency, I mentioned this before. If you have rules that relate to trade, publish them so everybody can see what the rules of engagement are. Publish them on your website, publish them in your gazette, publish them so they're readily available for anybody who wants to see. And then the final rule is dispute settlement. If 2 countries have a dispute about trade rules, then they settle that in the context of the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. So those are the 4 major rules on WTO. Not very controversial. What's more controversial, at least when we're speaking with stakeholders, when we're having town hall meetings, is really relating to the bilateral negotiations. And there are 2 parts of the bilateral negotiation. Market access on goods, so that's the extent to which we reduce in duties on products, customs duties reductions, and then market access on services, the extent to which we allow foreign participation in the services sectors in this country. There are 4 ways services can be provided. Essentially, mode 1 is like online. You provide a service online. You purchase products through Amazon. That's an online service provision. Mode 2 is if you as a Bahamian go abroad and consume that service somewhere else. So if you go abroad and shop in Walmart, you are consuming the retail or wholesale services of a Walmart. Mode 3, probably the most controversial, is the extent to which a foreign company can come into the Bahamas and set up a physical presence, a brick and mortar shop. And then 4, the extent to which an individual can provide a service in the Bahamas on a temporary basis. I mentioned that WTO does not deal with free movement of labor. It deals with the provision of services on a temporary basis. What I want to say here is that all of this is negotiated. In every single service sector, we negotiate to what extent we are going to provide access to the market. Every single product that's coming in, every single product, we decide to what extent are we going to reduce duties on those products. This is all a matter of negotiation. And what countries do is they identify in their services market those areas that are sensitive, and they say, we're not touching this, or we want to reserve these protections that we have for the sectors, but for these other areas, we're prepared to be a little bit more liberal. So it's not that you open your doors indiscriminately for any company to come and set up in the Bahamas. It's negotiated, and you are able to determine as a country to what extent you want to open your borders. So if you imagine that liberalization is like opening a door, you can leave it completely closed if you want. You can crack it if you want, so allow some online provision of that service, or you can completely fling it open, as we have in the context of tourism. We have large hotels that are here and operating, and it's very liberal. Financial services, any foreign bank can come and set up shop, not a problem. The sector has said, the more open, the better for us. So it is a matter of negotiation. The extent to which you open the door, the extent to which you liberalize is completely determined by the government. It can be open, it can be completely shut, and any variation in between that. So where we currently are now, as I mentioned, so there's the 3 tracks of negotiation. You can see where those are the arrows on the left-hand side, and we're about halfway through those negotiations. All of the arrows to the end, all of that gray is really just formal requirements. Once you've completed your negotiations, then you have to go through a set of procedures where the WTO ministers approve, and then you bring it home, you ratify it, which means you have to put it into law, go through your regular parliamentary process, your legal process at home. So we're about halfway through the negotiations that I mentioned earlier. Now, as I mentioned, we have some sensitive sectors. Countries are free to decide where are your sensitivities, what extent are you going to negotiate, or how are you going to negotiate based on your sensitivities. So as you see here, we have a few areas of services sectors that are reserved for Bahamians, or would be considered sensitive, And this is determined by the National Investment Policy. So any foreign person who wants to come and operate in any sector has to first go through the cabinet. The cabinet reviews it and they decide, yes, we're going to let this company come in, no, we're not. But it's through the National Investment Policy where the government has decided there are some areas that are reserved exclusively for Bahamians, i.e. no foreign participation. So here are some of them. Well, we know that's a policy, sometimes that has been breached, but again, it's a policy, so cabinet is free to do as it sees fit in that regard. But generally, the policy is, there are some areas that are reserved exclusively for Bahamians. Here they are: retail, real estate, construction, except specialty construction, transport, wholesale services, retail services is there as well, legal services, some restaurants, except specialty restaurants, ethnic restaurants, commercial fishing within the exclusive economic zone. Some water sport is also included there. So that's about 23% or 26% of the economy, more or less. And then you have the non-reserve economy, which is really about 72%. That is the 2 founding pillars of the economy. That's really tourism and financial services. And you'll see that's in brown because that area is really already very open. It is as open as it could be. So that's, using my example of flinging open the door, that door is wide open. It always has been. And so because of that, it means that we're not really negotiating that in these WTO negotiations. That is open, it's already compliant with the WTO strictures, it's already free and liberal trade in the context of those sectors. So really the headache, as Mr. Lang likes to put it, is with these areas, these sensitive areas. And what we're doing is we engage each of the sectors in a series of consultations so that they can indicate what their concerns are, what they can live with, what they can accommodate, what they can't accommodate. And so that's what's negotiated. Now, I mentioned a few times, it's a negotiation. So what that means is we go to the table and we say, here's our offer. These are our open sectors, we're gonna keep them open, no problem. Here are our closed sectors, we're gonna keep them closed. We don't want any foreign participation in those sectors. That's what we put on the table. So our trading partners may come back to us and say, okay, well, you know, we have an interest in retail, or we have an interest in wholesale, we'd like to see you open that. It's up to us to determine whether we accede to that request, or whether we say, okay, only in limited circumstances are we able to agree to it, and that is being determined by the consultations we have with the sectors. So as I mentioned, it's a negotiation. States are free to ask to open, they can ask whatever they want. They can ask us to open, and the government is equally free to say, yes, no, maybe so, under what conditions. The negotiation objective is to join the WTO, maintaining those reserve sectors that we have now. But we see that in joining, if this one on the right is where we are now, what we want to do is enter the WTO and maintain those reserve sectors to the extent that we can. There may be some shrinkage. We anticipate that there will be some shrinkage because you can't go into negotiation and say, we ain't doing that when we come in just like we are. Because that's not a negotiation. There has to be some give and take. So we anticipate there will be some shrinkage. But the negotiation objective is to maintain those reservations to the extent that is possible. And in every step of the way, we are working with the sectors, we are discussing with the sectors, with their associations, so that they can indicate to us what they will be comfortable with. If we go back to the table and we put this on the table, we are going to permit foreign participation in real estate, provided it is through a franchise. You have Sotheby's come in, they franchise Sotheby's, but the franchise have to be owned by Bahamians. That's some shrinkage, because right now we're saying it's completely closed. Well, Sotheby's is a foreign company, it's a foreign brand, but they actually operating now in the sector. So we anticipate there may be some shrinkage, but we are working with each of the sectors to determine what they would be comfortable, what they're able to live with. In the context of professional services that you may be interested in, what was offered for these sectors, architects and engineers, really was what is already in existence now. So what we have in the legislation. The legislation provides that if you are in architectural practice, or if you're going to engage in architectural practice, you have to be a Bahamian citizen or a permanent resident. Equally as an engineer, the Professional Engineers Act requires you to be a citizen or permanent resident to be engaged in professional engineering. That's what we have offered. Construction, again, what we have offered is what we already have in existence now. We have construction is available to foreign investors to provide construction services in the market where there are specialty construction is involved. Construction sector has said they have some concerns with this specialty construction, and that's fine, but the truth of the matter is this is what we already have on the ground now. And so through this process of consulting, we have asked them to, well, let's decide how that should be framed. What is specialty construction? How should that be considered? What would you be comfortable with? Because there are some areas where we may not have the expertise, and so we may need that foreign expertise. And then in the context of quantity surveyors, because I'm told there may be some quantity surveyors in the room, this wasn't even put on the table. So it's not in the offer. What does that mean? If a sector is not in the offer, it means we're not talking about it, it means nothing is going to change. If we don't have it, we only offer what we're prepared to make some adjustments in. And states may say to us, well, you haven't put this on the table, we want you to put this on the table, and we can consider it. Quantity surveyors was not on the table, land surveyors was not on the table either, and through the negotiations, we haven't had any requests for it, through the negotiations, we'll see how that goes. It may be that it never comes up. I would say, as I mentioned, it's a negotiation. For architecture and engineering, there has been a request that we be more liberal in this area. Again, we are discussing it with the sectors, we had meetings with the Ministry of Works as well, and we don't intend to make any adjustment to this at the moment, and we will continue to work with the sectors as the negotiations proceed. So that was basically what was offered in professional services. And that's really kind of the overview of where we are, the process of WTO accession negotiations, how it operates. Perhaps you may have some questions that you may want to ask. And so at this point, instead of me rambling on about other things, we can open the floor for questions, and I'll allow the moderator to do that.